one time, there was very little going on within the region other than some minor logging and fisheries. That was essentially it. But as of late, in the last couple of decades, we've seen a lot of interest from other entities within the world to access our place, to get uses out of it. You have the oil and gas industry, you have the renewable energy industry. There's a range of recreational structures that are building up here, from cruise ships to major sport fishing and recreational fishing opportunities. So that is coming our way, if it isn't already here. And the pressures are becoming quite substantial in terms of the marine environment. There are a lot of pressures out there. There's a lot of need for access. How do you best develop that? Coming from a governance role, we have a tendency to plan things very rigorously. We're both obligated and legislated, to be perfectly honest, to provide responsible planning on behalf of our constituents. So this sort of fits in with the overall. We've done a very comprehensive land management plan here on the North Coast for a number of years. That was instituted. We have the Central Coast Plan as well. We've done a range of things around the terrestrial. And now it's time to take a look at the marine and say, all right, just how do we want to use this environment, and what would be the best and most responsible uses of this environment?
The idea of integrated planning really comes from the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which was ratified in 1994. And one of the major bases for that was to ensure that coastal communities are connected to the resources that are on their doorsteps, and that independent fishermen have access to those resources, and that they're not just taken from the oceans by foreign countries coming in and fishing our coast. And the Canadian government's response was our Oceans Act that set out and tasked the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to take that leadership role and develop integrated plans for sustainable development on our coast to protect the ecosystem. So they have a mandate to lead that, and they really need to step up and take that leadership because of the importance of the oceans to our country and to the people on this planet and to all the other species on this planet as well.
My name is Art Starrett, and I'm the Executive Director for the Coastal First Nations. Our territories extend from the mainland around the top end of Vancouver Island all the way to the BC-Alaska border. So it's about 2/3 of the coast of BC, and we're an organization that plans for the future. That's really what it's all about. That everything that we do has to be based on a plan. And so we began together, working together, on a plan to build, to breathe life into the rights and the title that we have in this region. We do that by land use planning. We do that by marine use planning. And so we began with a massive land use plan that became known as the Great Bear Rainforest.
In the mid-1990s, an epic battle over the clear-cutting of ancient rainforests, a battle which came to be known as the War in the Woods, raged along the BC coast. Lasting a decade, this conflict was finally resolved when the opposing parties arrived at a joint vision that created the land use plan for the Great Bear and protected 50% of the Great Bear Rainforest. The strategy to resolve conflicts over natural resources by collaborative planning is now being put into action in the waters of the Great Bear Sea, where our demands on the ocean are stressing both the marine environment and local communities to the limit.
So planning, whether it's terrestrial or marine, is no different. Looking now, it seems like it was obvious we should have done this a long time ago. Forest companies started to realize pretty early on, particularly with the Great Bear Rainforest, that you couldn't just fight it. It had to be a joint exercise. A lot of the things that I do outside of the planning is restoration. And I learned quite early on that talking with First Nations and particularly the elders on what was there before, it was incredibly valuable information, and it steered a lot of my decision making. The relationships with First Nations now that we have in the Great Bear Rainforest are by and large quite good.
We have taken that blueprint for success on the terrestrial side and moved that over into the marine side. And that's where we always want industry to be with us. Whether it's the BC Seafood Alliance, which represents the majority of commercial licenses in the province, or some small sector, we want them all in the room. We want everybody in the room. We're pretty pragmatic. We recognize that people have needs. They have privileges they've been granted by various governments, and we recognize those as well. But they also have to recognize that we have rights that we're not going to allow to be undercut.
I remember the first battles for the Great Bear Rainforest back in the 90s, and I was still in high school then, and I remember going to some of the meetings that they had. A lot of the forest companies, had a schedule to come and log the Great Bear Rainforest. It wasn't known as Great Bear Rainforest back then. But at the time, my community basically said that, we had plans for our land and for our water, and when we talked about protection, we talked about protection for both, and we didn't really see land and water as two separate things. But unfortunately, the way the provincial and federal governments work, that's, land is provincial and feds as water. So we had to separate the two in order to come forward with some solid protection. So I think we started working on the land use planning first, and back then we looked at about 50% protection for the territory, which is huge for the area, but wanted to protect the values that the Kitasoo Hayes people had in those areas. So we picked some very key areas and looked at protecting all the species within those areas, including the forests. So now we have about 47.5% of the Kitasoo Hayes territory locked up in protected area. Now we're able to sit down with forest companies and determine where forestry is going to happen, and making sure that those forest companies aren't impacting food areas, cultural areas, ecological areas. So that's been very important, and I think now we want to kind of translate that sort of management onto the marine side. By developing these marine spatial zones like we have on the land side, that will help us protect multiple species and make sure that those species continue to be there, and not just for First Nations but for everyone.
And it's really only through coming together and having those discussions with the user groups, with our neighboring nations, that we're able to understand there is a role for us to play, and it's actually incumbent upon us as First Nations leaders to play that role, to bring that balance to the environmentalists, to bring that balance to the industry, and make sure that they understand that there's a long-term game plan here. It's not about the next quarter profits or the next fundraising campaign. This is about a long-term plan to bring sustainability back to our communities as it existed before contact.
The ecosystem has to support itself first before it can support anyone from the outside. So the conservation needs to maintain the species that are here, to maintain the people that are living in it, whether it's a First Nation or a non-First Nation community. And then if there's surplus that can support people from the outside, then by all means, then there's those opportunities. So this has allowed people to take stock, I think, in marine planning in terms of all the resources. So all that detailed work was done at looking at every resource, what needed to be protected for conservation, which areas, what system of protection was necessary, which areas were important culturally for people to access for food, and then you look, okay, what's the fat that's left over in terms of the opportunity once you've looked after the ecosystem and cultural needs. And then of course you identify certain areas as well that can support certain types of industry, whether it is shellfish farming, whether it is finfish farming, whether it's a marine hydro project, with a turbine and a tidal turbine. Wind power is being looked after in terms of energy needs, because that's often a marine industry, because they build the towers in marine sites. So all of these things are being kind of looked at into the future.